You've just won a war. Nearly 3 years of fighting, 1 million dead by the careful counts, and somehow the country is still in one piece. You did that. So tell me, what do you think the danger looks like now? A rival army, a hostile border, something you can see coming. On the morning of July 29, 1975, General Yakubu Gowon boards a plane for Uganda, for a summit of the men he calls his fellow heads of state, certain the threat is somewhere out there, past a border he controls. He is wrong. The men who end his 9 years running Nigeria aren't waiting on the other side of anything. They're already in Lagos in his own barracks, and by the time his plane touches down again, everything has already changed. Stay for this one, because by the end, you're not just going to know that Gowon lost power in Kampala. You're going to know how this exact morning connects forward to 2 more sudden endings inside the next 4 years, one of them belonging to the very man who delivers the news, and how Gowon himself helped put that man in the room in the first place. And later, in Act 2, Scene 7 of a play you've probably read in school, you'll hear the exact line Gowon reportedly reached for within hours of losing everything. And once you know why he chose it, you'll understand something about him that most of the men in that barracks never did. So what actually is a coup in your head right now? Ask most people and you'll get some version of the same answer. Tanks in the street, soldiers on the radio, a country waking up to gunfire. Chaos, basically. Fast chaos. Ask a slightly more cynical person and you'll get a second answer. One man's ambition, a general who wanted the chair for himself. Both of those answers are true just often enough to be useless. Here's what watching these fall apart teaches you instead. The fast part is almost never the real story, and it's almost never really about the chair. The real story is slower, and it usually starts with a number nobody trusts. To see what I mean, you have to go back further than 1975, 9 years further, to a dispute that has nothing to do with Gowon at all, and everything to do with why anyone would risk their career to remove him. Picture yourself in Nigeria in 1962, 5 years old as an independent country, still working out who actually holds the power in a federation built from 3 very different regions stitched together by a colonial map. In this system, the thing that decides how many seats each region gets in parliament and how much federal money flows its way is a single number: population. So when the 1962 census comes back showing the North with just over 22 million people and the South's 3 regions combined at more than 23 million, Southern politicians are thrilled and Northern politicians reject the count outright. The Prime Minister cancels it. A new count runs in 1963. This time the North comes back with nearly 30 million, enough to reclaim an outright majority, and the federal government and 2 regions accept it. The other 2 call it inflated. Nobody outside the argument can tell you, even now, which side was actually right, and if you're already trying to guess, notice how fast you reached for a side. You don't need to know a single detail of Nigerian electoral law to recognize this fight. It's the fight over who counts, in any system where headcount decides money and seats. What's not disputed is what the census crisis did. It hardened the regional distrust that was already curdling Nigerian politics, and historians point to it as one of the things that helped set up the country's first military coup a few years later. The one in January 1966, when a group of officers killed the Prime Minister and a northern regional premier, and a counter-coup that July put the next people in charge, including a 31-year-old colonel named Yakubu Gowon. So Gowon doesn't inherit a country. He inherits an argument about who gets counted, dressed up as a country, and you don't win an argument like that. At absolute best, you can only manage it for a while. How long would you give yourself in his position before people stopped believing you were still managing it. You know the next part already, even if you've never run a country. Picture a manager who tells their team, "Give me 6 years and I'll hand you the department." Everyone signs up for that. 2 years in, the deadline slips a little. Fine, these things happen. 4 years in, it slips again, and now people stop asking when and start quietly asking each other what they're going to do instead. By year 6, nobody in that room is waiting for the handover anymore. They're planning around the person who was supposed to give it to them. Sound familiar? You've probably worked for that manager. You may, on a bad week, have been that manager. That's almost exactly what Gowon does with his own country. In October 1970, fresh off winning the Civil War, he lays out a 9-point plan. Fix corruption, finish a stalled national census, that argument again, hold elections, hand power to a civilian government, all of it by 1976. 4 years later, in October 1974, he stands up and says the date is unrealistic. He doesn't offer a new one. He just leaves the room open-ended. And when the promised new census actually runs in 1973, it reopens the exact wound from 1962. Editorials call it a charade rigged for future revenue and parliamentary seats. The same accusation, verbatim, from a decade earlier. Layer in an oil boom making some people extremely rich, while the war-damaged country underneath them stays exactly as broken. And you already know this part too. If you've ever watched a windfall land unevenly on a team that just went through something hard together, and you don't have a coup waiting to happen out of nowhere. You have a room full of officers who have quietly stopped waiting, for reasons that go back further than any of them are saying out loud, to you or to each other. Now here's the part that makes July 29th almost too neat to be believed. And it's not embellishment. It's the actual reason Gowon is in Kampala at all. He isn't just attending that summit. He's the outgoing chairman of the Organization of African Unity, and he is there specifically to hand the chairmanship over to Idi Amin. That handover is controversial before Gowon even boards the plane. Tanzania's government is refusing to attend in protest of Amin's record, and other leaders are wavering. And it's Gowon himself who leans on his fellow heads of state to show up anyway, publicly appealing to them to come support their African brother. Sit with that for a second. The man about to lose everything spends his last few days in office as president persuading other presidents to trust the one man who's about to take his own country away from him. If you're waiting for the part where Gowon gets some kind of warning sign, a moment his gut should have caught, this is probably the closest the story gets, and even in hindsight, he walks straight past it. Picture the morning of July 29th, split across 2 rooms 1,200 miles apart. In Lagos, officers who have served under Gowon for years, men he trained, men he promoted, move through the barracks with the calm, unhurried certainty of people executing a plan they've rehearsed. No shouting, no gunfire, just doors, keys, and a radio studio. This has been coming for a while. In Kampala, 1,200 miles east, Gowon is still doing the diplomatic work of handing Amin his new title, in a conference hall thick with delegates and translators, an agenda about decolonization and Southern Africa listed for that day, talking about anything and everything except what's happening at home. Back in Lagos, Colonel Joseph Garba steps up to a microphone at Radio Nigeria. There's a click, a beat of dead air, and then his voice cuts into the country's ordinary Tuesday morning broadcast and tells listeners in plain terms that Gowon's government is over. He cites the thing everyone already half knew, postponing the return to civilian rule, indefinitely, with no new promise attached. Within hours, Brigadier Murtala Mohammed is named the new head of state. His deputy is a young officer named Olusegun Obasanjo. Remember that name. It matters twice more before this story is done. Now picture the actual handoff of the news in Kampala, because this is the moment the whole video has been walking toward. Somewhere in or around that summit venue between sessions, with African heads of state still finishing each other's diplomatic sentences a few rooms away, Idi Amin finds Gowon and tells him plainly, face to face, that he no longer has a country to go home to. Not a rival delegate, not a stranger, the man he just spent days defending to a room full of skeptical peers. If part of you is wondering whether you'd have seen it coming, the slipping date, the census anger, the mood in the barracks, you're not alone. Most of the officers standing next to Gowon that week didn't see it coming either. That's not a failure of instinct. That's just how slow things look, right up until they're not slow anymore. So what does Gowon reportedly do with the news? Nothing you'd expect from a man just told his career is over by a man he just publicly vouched for. He doesn't argue, doesn't ask for troops, doesn't fight it. He goes out to the reporters waiting outside and, according to accounts from that day, quotes Shakespeare. As You Like It, Act 2, Scene 7. All the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances. It's a strange line to reach, for in the moment your exit is happening in real time, in front of cameras, on a continent that isn't even yours, delivered by the man you just talked everyone into trusting. He tells Nigerians to support whoever comes next, and then he flies to England. Not for a week, for 8 years. He studies for a PhD in political science at the University of Warwick, settles into a quiet corner of Hertfordshire, and, by several accounts, serves a term as church warden at his local parish church. He doesn't set foot back in Nigeria again until 1983. Here's where the tidy version of this story stops being tidy. Murtala Mohammed, the man installed in Gowon's place, moves fast, and for a while it works. On February 3, 1976, he carves the country into 7 new states, trying to bring government closer to people who'd spent a decade distrusting the census that was supposed to represent them. Before that, his government dismisses more than 10,000 public officials in an anti-corruption purge that Nigerian students in particular genuinely love him for. Stern, blunt, fast-moving, the exact opposite of the unrealistic date, Gowon kept not quite explaining. He looks, for about 7 months, like the man who was going to actually finish what Gowon started. You can probably think of a leader like this in your own lifetime. The one who shows up after years of drift and just starts doing things, and for a while everyone lets themselves believe the drift is over. Would you have trusted him? Be honest. 10 days after creating those 7 states, on the 13th of February, 1976, it's a stretch of ordinary Lagos traffic that turns on him, his car. On a commute he's made dozens of times, blocked and then torn apart by gunfire, on a faction of officers led by a lieutenant colonel named Bukar Suka Dimka. Murtala is killed on his own commute, in his own capital, by men who wore the same uniform he did. Dimka gets on the radio himself, the same way Garba did 7 months earlier, the same static, the same dead air, the same practiced calm in the voice, but this time the broadcast doesn't land. There's no orderly handover waiting on the other end of it. In his own broadcast, Dimka reaches for almost the same language Garba used 7 months earlier: corruption, indecision, a government that had stopped listening, as if the justification itself had become a template anyone could pick up. But this time nobody with real authority backs the words. Loyal officers move within hours. The plot collapses, and Dimka spends 3 weeks running before he's caught, and that May, executed along with several co-conspirators. Sit with the shape of that for a second. 2 radio broadcasts, 7 months apart, announcing that a Nigerian head of state's time is over. One works cleanly and hands power to a named successor by nightfall. The other kills a popular reformer and goes nowhere. What's the difference between a coup that becomes a government and one that becomes an execution in your gut? Most people guess the plotters were better organized. Historians don't fully agree on it either: timing, loyalty, whether enough of the army had actually been convinced beforehand, or just how many people happened to believe the broadcast in the first 90 minutes. It's a genuinely open question in the historical record because the plotters were organized doesn't actually distinguish the two cases. Both of them were. That job, surviving and actually finishing the job, falls to the deputy. Obasanjo, the young officer whose name you were asked to remember, becomes head of state after Murtala's death. And here's where this whole story finally closes a loop that started back with a 9-point plan and a slipped deadline. Obasanjo keeps the promise Gowon broke. He runs the transition properly, holds the elections, and on the 1st of October 1979, hands power to a civilian president, Shehu Shagari, elected that August. Nigerians call it the Second Republic. Historians call it something rarer than that: a military head of state who gave power back on purpose, without being forced to, at a time when almost nobody on the continent was doing that. The promise that cost Gowon his job gets kept 4 years later, just not by him, and not without two more sudden endings standing between the promise and the keeping of it. And Ammon, ask yourself honestly whether you saw this next part coming when his name first showed up in this story as the messenger. His own ending arrives on the 11th of April 1979, less than 6 months before Obasanjo's handover, when Tanzanian troops and Ugandan exile forces take Kampala and he flees the city he once ruled from, and once briefly chaired an entire continent's diplomacy from. He escapes first to Libya, then to Saudi Arabia, where he lives out the rest of his life and dies in 2003. The man who told Gowon it was over, in the gentlest way anyone in this story tells anyone anything, finds out what it feels like from the other side within 4 years. And notice, if you're keeping track, that he took power from Obote the exact same way he later gave the news to Gowon, while the previous owner was out of the country, at a summit, being polite to people who weren't going to help him. One more piece before we zoom out, because it's the part that actually answers the question you might be sitting with right now. What happens to the man himself afterward? Gowon spends those 8 years finishing the degree, and by the time he's ready to come home, he's already been formally pardoned by the government Obasanjo eventually handed power to. He lands back in Lagos on the 5th of December, 1983, to a welcome warm enough to worry Nigeria's political class, who spend the next few years watching him for any sign he's about to run for office. He tells reporters at the airport he isn't, and he doesn't. He becomes a professor of political science at the University of Jos instead, and by the 1990s, he's founded a movement called Nigeria Prays and a foundation working on disease eradication. And read that twice: good governance. Decades later, the man who once let a return to civilian rule deadline quietly expire is turning up as an official election observer in other African countries' votes. You can decide for yourself whether that's redemption, atonement, or just what a long life gives a person time to become. Zoom out with me for a moment, because none of this happens in a vacuum, and you deserve to know how typical or unusual what you just watched actually was. Between roughly 1960 and 1990, dozens of African and Asian nations that had just one independence went through exactly this kind of sudden, mid-decade power break. Young armies, young institutions, and a lot of young officers discovering, in real time, that the machinery for removing a leader without an election was sitting right there in the barracks the whole time. You're not watching one unusually unstable country in this video. You're watching one clearly documented example of something that was happening in some form almost everywhere that had recently stopped being someone else's colony. That doesn't make Nigeria's version less specific or less worth understanding in its own right. The census, the promise, the exact men involved, none of that repeats anywhere else. It just means the shape underneath it, a fragile promise, a room that stops believing it, a plan that was sitting there the whole time was, in that particular stretch of history, close to the default setting. If you came in expecting one country's freak accident, that shape repeats elsewhere in the same 30 years. Stay subscribed and you'll see it again. So take stock with me for a second. In roughly a decade, a census nobody trusted helps trigger Nigeria's first coup. That coup and its counter-coup put a 31-year-old colonel in charge of a country. He then runs for 9 years on borrowed patience. He loses that country to a man he just finished vouching for internationally, at a summit he was there to help legitimize. That man's replacement is popular, fast, reformist, and dead within 7 months, at the hands of men wearing his own uniform. That man's own deputy is the one who finally, quietly, keeps the promise that started this whole chain 4 years after the fact. And the messenger who started the loudest chapter of it loses his own country the same way he took someone else's, within the same 4 years. How many of those threads did you actually clock while they were happening, versus just now, laid end to end? It is a pattern, and not a coincidence dressed up as one. A broken revenue-sharing promise, inside a young institution built on a headcount nobody trusted, is one of the most reliable coup triggers of this entire stretch of 20th century history, not because these particular officers were unusually treacherous, but because that exact kind of promise breaks the same way almost everywhere it's made. Nigeria's version has its own census, its own 9-point plan, its own names. The mechanism underneath it doesn't. Here's what actually changes once you've sat with all of this. The danger was never a rival army or a hostile border. It was a room full of people who trusted him less every year, for reasons he kept handing them himself, inside a country that had been arguing about who gets counted since before he ever held power. What does that actually change for you? Maybe nothing you run is a country. Maybe the biggest thing you're responsible for is a team, a family, a project with a deadline you've quietly moved twice already. But trust, wherever you're spending it, was never something you bank once. It's something you keep earning in the room, every time you're the one holding the date, and the people around you are always doing the math on whether you're still good for it, whether or not they say so out loud. The uncomfortable part isn't that Gowon lost track of that. It's how ordinary and unremarkable losing track of it actually looks, from the inside, while it's happening to you. So that border you pictured at the start, the one Gowon thought the danger was beyond, it was never out there. It was in the room he'd already left, in a barracks full of men doing arithmetic he'd stopped explaining to them. Years afterward, Gowon himself said, on the record, that he'd had some foreknowledge the coup was coming, and that he wasn't especially bothered by it. Take him at his word, and July 29th wasn't the surprise it looked like from the outside. It was a man stepping off a stage he already suspected was closing, reaching for the one speech in the English language written specifically for that moment, because some part of him had already rehearsed the exit. That's the true origin of Nigeria's quietest coup. Not a hostile border, not one general's ambition, a 9-year-old promise about who gets counted finally coming due.